Open world games are everywhere in the modern day. Whether it's playing as a criminal in the streets of the Grand Theft Auto series, playing as a scrappy adventurer in the Elder Scrolls, or playing as a Middle Eastern assassin doing parkour over rooftops. These games are everywhere. Everyone's trying to make their own world, and they want to let their players loose in it. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't work out, and sometimes they're just kind of there.
Open world games have evolved quite a bit from the original inception. They have gotten to the point where it has almost become less of a genre and more of a mandate for a lot of developers. But not all of them are created the same way. Making an open world game is easy. Slap a big map on there, either render a bunch of buildings or trees everywhere, have some NPCs walk around it, and then let the player fuck around. There you go, you made an open world game. But making a compelling one is tricky, and there's no simple way to do it. So developers have gone through different paths when it comes to making them stand out from each other. Sometimes this means making a world that conveys immersion and can generate a feeling of belonging through the story and characters. Maybe the open world exists to be a playground for the vast sandbox gameplay, and a large majority of builds that a character can utilize. Or maybe, the open world is meant to represent the story being told, and it can be seen as its own character.
These are the ways that I have seen developers utilize their open worlds, and they have both been successful and failures in their own right. But today, I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to go in and see what makes these games stand out from each other, what makes them work and what makes them not work. So go ahead and get a drink and get comfortable, because this one is going to be a doozy.
While the worlds themselves are the main focus of all open world games, the protagonist is the one that sets himself up as a sort of driver between the player and the world. And how the world and the NPCs react to the player character is a big part on what makes them work.
The character also acts as a great puppet for the character to control as they roam the world and are able to go wherever they want. Much like how in the real world, you're able to go where you want to. Mostly. I mean, I can't go in there. I mean, I could if I wanted to, but I mean, it's a lot of barbed wire, and I'd probably get arrested and fined for it, so it sounds like a poor decision overall.
In that sense, it's important to make a protagonist that is capable of affecting the world in some way, and in a major way while roaming around. Sometimes that means taking out a rocket launcher and blowing up cars as an Eastern European immigrant, or swinging around Queens as Spider-Man stopping someone from getting mugged. The characters are usually given tools that let them adjust and interact with the world in the way that the developers account for. And this can be used in more ways than one. It can be something simple like the arsenal in Grand Theft Auto, which allows for more and more chaos as you earn more money and commit atrocities. Or more cyberware to allow you to double jump and zoom across the city like you're playing Surf in CSGO. This ties in with the characters that we play as in these games, as they have to make sense within the game's world. Like when they have this equipment, they also have to be capable of using them. Like when you're playing Far Cry 3 and Jason is getting more experience with guns, and he is more willing to skin both animals and people while burning them alive listening to Skrillex. Shout out to the year of 2012. It makes sense within the context of the story and the character because this is an island full of pirates, and if you want to survive this island, you gotta get good at throwing knives at people's eyeballs. Oh, and speaking of, that's another good point to bring up. When you look at games like Far Cry, Batman, Shadow of War, these games supply the player with characters that are capable of many abilities that get enhanced over time. Throughout the game, they achieve skills and unlock new abilities that your character is capable of doing. And as the game continually gets more expansive and difficult, these abilities really start to help as they support you through the game, whether it's from traveling the world or dealing with enemies. But the thing about these abilities is that they stay in line with who you are playing as, and while there can sort of be different builds, and the player can lean towards one ability over the other, they ultimately result in the same character. It's just a matter of achieving it in the endgame. Alex Mercer might have 3 different mutated blade arms, but they all serve the purpose of chopping people better. And the reason for that is that these games want the character to go down specific paths, and the world is reflective on that. The journey of an open world is one that the player experiences through these characters and how they are reacting to the world. The player is the push that gets them to their full potential, so to speak. What about games that don't have these types of abilities? Titles like GTA, Red Dead Redemption, Saints Row, Just Cause, and Mafia, just to name a few. In these titles, this is less about the abilities and skill point system that I mentioned before, and very few of them even have a leveling system. Now, there are still some aspects of that in these games, like the different character abilities in GTA 5, or even the perks in Saints Row 3, but that's basically it. The main progression that happens with these games comes down to if and when they're making bank, or if they can just find a cool-ass car to steal for like 20 minutes before they blow it up. The characters in these titles are a lot more restricted in a sort of sense, because their base stats don't really change from the beginning of the game compared to the end of it. Nico in GTA 4 is always capable of killing anyone he encounters, and those same people pose the same threat to him as well. But what's different is that as the story goes on, he goes from fighting people with his hands to getting in pistol shootouts, and finally whipping out M16s to fight off the entire LCPD in a bank robbery. Also, holy shit, this mission is still so fucking hard over 10 years later. But anyway, my point is that the characters themselves aren't changing and getting stronger, but their arsenal is. And it's more on the player to determine the power level, as they are more or less on the same playing field as the other NPCs around them. But there are still changes that the characters can affect throughout the world that can tip in their scale. The main thing being the ownership of different territories. Going back before, the money being a big part of the progression in these games. The character's real power comes from the amount the player is willing to invest in, and it plays a big part in the world as well. They can either buy or conquer new territories that will increase the amount of money they gain, which makes it easier to buy weapons and armor, and to complete missions, and so on and so forth. These games provide players with a character that progresses more with the world and story, rather than a leveling system. Characters like Nico, Tommy, Rico, the boss, and Vito will remain the same by the end of the game, but their arsenal and territory, and even their wardrobe, will greatly increase by then. And that's the appeal of these games. In both cases, they are about reaching the full potential of a specific character, but one uses leveling to do that, and the other uses currency. But what about games where the characters have multiple builds? This is where we get into more RPG-based games where the player is capable of speccing into multiple different types of playstyles, and the characters themselves are more blank canvases for the player to experiment and do what they want. Right off the bat, Skyrim gives the player a wide variety of races to choose from, and while they do still have the leveling system mentioned before, there are now multiple different trees to explore. And it's in this sense that these games allow for the player to go out and explore and play the game in their own way. This is coupled with missions that are able to be completed with multiple skills. Want to murder everyone on sight? Here's the gun. Go do crime. Want to sneak around like a ghost? Here's the silencer. Go do crime. And this is highlighted with the characters that the developers provide to the player. The courier's only real role is that he's a wastelander mailman. And that's all we really need to know about them, because living in this shithole, it's going to require you to adapt and utilize many survival skills to stay alive. So that in turn gives them access to be capable of dealing with dangerous situations in a variety of ways. And that includes just talking their way out of bad situations. But even games that provide you with a character still give you the option to modify them your own way. Geralt in The Witcher is a great example. He is a skilled monster hunter and a capable fighter, and thus he has skills with sword fighting, signs, and alchemy. But the game world is flexible enough to allow the player to find out which build suits them the best, and utilize it as they see fit, making it work when you get caught by different monsters and enemies in the world. These games are way more about the freedom of movement throughout the world, as they allow for more diverse playstyles out of the other games. However, that comes at a cost. While Skyrim, Fallout, and Cyberpunk allow for varied playstyles while traveling the world, and by no means have bad gameplay, They will often get overshadowed by the games mentioned before that have a lot more focused and restrictive gameplay systems. Since Jason will always be using a gun and shooting compared to the Courier, who has to be accounted for multiple different playstyles, Far Cry 3 is going to feel better as a shooter compared to New Vegas. Because these games have a different focus. The characters act as an essential part of these worlds. On top of allowing us to explore and face the challenges within them, they are also the tool that the devs give us to explore the worlds, and each one stands out along with the worlds that they live in. This may seem like a no-brainer to most people, but the world is the most important part of these games that separate them from each other. The worlds must exist in a way that fit the mold for what the developers are trying to achieve. And this practice is very different when making a sprawling city, to an island that holds many regions, to a radiated-filled wasteland. Look at any game that takes place in a city. Usually the game's AI will do its best to promote that the sense that the city is alive, and that the events are happening even without the player's interference. And when they happen, the player gets to choose whether or not they want to get involved. This grows that feeling of immersion, and it brings the game world into a more meaningful experience as a result, but at the same time, do this too much, and the believability of your game can start to falter. As some players can see through the illusion and find that the game is just handing them a lot of these situations, rather than them happening naturally. I had this feeling when I played Red Dead Redemption 2, as there are a lot of random events that happened incredibly consistently, that after a while, they don't really feel as special anymore. I don't want to stop to help someone that lost their horse when it's the 12th fucking person that I've passed that had the same problem. I got enough problems dealing with my own horses in this goddamn game. But sometimes the lack of random events can be just as impactful for the experience, especially when the player has a large impact on the world. I remember when successfully destroying all the Mongol camps in a region in Ghost of Tsushima, I rode through that area, and there was a large lack of enemies. And it's moments like these that you can look back in pride as this place is now back to its peaceful state because of you. And it even makes a difference gameplay-wise as shops and villages start to open up in places that were occupied by the enemies. This is where we get into the two different types of worlds. There are some maps that just exist how they are and they are not meant to be altered by the player unless it's a big story moment. And then there are worlds that are constantly changing from the actions that they do with every quest. Modern Rockstar games fit the mold of worlds that stay relatively the same. And the big changes usually come in on larger story moments. But the main focus on this game is the interactions with the characters, and the world serves as a sort of jungle gym for the player. And it's more about the discovery rather than the change. Tears of the Kingdom and Elden Ring also come to mind, as these worlds merely exist in all its glory, and it's dependent on the player to explore and find the secrets that each waterfall holds. Unless the developers decide to be little bastards and not put a secret behind the waterfall. But they have an advantage of being incredibly vast to the point that there are videos that come out years later about some well-kept secret that no one knew. This also comes with the benefit of having the progression of the characters be part of the exploration. With every shrine or dungeon you find, it makes them worth doing as it leads you to being able to get another step forward to a new upgrade, while also holding on to any loot that can be worthwhile. And sure, maybe the piece of gear you found wasn't exactly what you wanted, but it's still worth doing the dungeon because getting the Beads of Light gives you more stamina or health, and that's what a good open world game should do. Give you incentive to move out and explore the world, and that can be as simple as just making the player stronger. But they can also be capable of attracting the player's attention through landmarks and the environments themselves. Take the markings in Tears of the Kingdom. They are bright and easily identifiable, which makes them stand out and calls the players to go investigate. And with enough time, you even start to notice when things look out of place. You pay attention more often, like when you see a rock that's missing from a pattern, and then you place it in, and you get another fucking Korok seed! Now, something I'm sure you've noticed is that these titles will always have a waypoint system of some sort. A compass that guides the player to whatever their next current objective is. Now, I am a firm believer that light handholding in games is a good thing. Recently, there's been a large discourse that devs have been making things way too obvious to the player. This mainly started with Resident Evil 4 Remake and the yellow paint that highlights what players can interact with. Now, as if bitching about a color wasn't dumb enough, people need to understand that gamers are fucking stupid. Making things obvious is not a bad thing, and that goes for waypoint systems in open world games. It's not a bad thing to have some kind of indication on a map or a compass that tells you where you're supposed to go, especially when the worlds are incredibly massive. Now, this does vary to a point, and I think there is a good balance that needs to be set when it comes to waypoints in general. A majority of Bethesda games are examples of too much handholding, as a lot of the game after a while becomes less about exploring your environment and more about just getting to the marker to check off a quest, and it can get really monotonous. However, Elden Ring, at launch, is an example of a game not giving enough of a guiding hand. Now, it's less of a problem in the main quest, it's a huge problem in the side quests, as when you talk to someone and they tell you to go to a location, there are often various other caveats to complete the task that they just assigned you. And for most people, it's not exactly easy to follow these tasks without a guide. These types of questlines work in more linear Metroidvania style games where you're expected to go back and forth to the same zones, but in a game as big as this, I would appreciate at least some guidance. There's a balance that needs to be met. There should be guides to help the player that just want to move on so they can progress and continue the game. But there should also be secrets rewarded to the eagle-eyed players that want to delve deeper and spend more time investigating. This is where I appreciate games that have visible landmarks because they allow the player to examine the world and they go to a building or a statue that catches their eye. But I also have to come to appreciate games that allow you to place your own waypoint through the binoculars, like the color waypoints in Zelda. They are a great way to let the player determine the places they want to go. But I also appreciate what Ghost of Tsushima does, where the wind guides the player, quite literally involving the environment in the gameplay mechanics. In a vacuum, these worlds may just blend together. Modern city, future city. Fantasy forest, historic forest. Suburb wasteland, desert wasteland. But when they are coupled with the mechanics and the player's intuition, they begin to stand out and make their own mark. But at the end of the day, what sets these games apart from each other? Because they all match the terms of being big places to run around in, whether it's a grassland or a city. Sometimes it can be the mechanics of the game that stand out more than the open world itself. Something like Shadow of War comes to mind because on the surface level, this game is just a mix of Assassin's Creed and Arkham with a Lord of the Rings skin on it. Yet players have fond memories of it because of the Nemesis system. The mechanic where you're able to see a list of orc captains and they evolve based on whether you kill them or they kill you. The constant change of orcs climbing a ladder of leadership and being able to recruit them onto your side and run sieges and invasions, it stood out from that mechanic and the player freedom that people still play it to this day. And the open world complements this and allows for the orc captains to move around different parts of the map and encourage the player to utilize their surroundings and get stronger from it. Sometimes games just have a fun gameplay loop like Infamous and Prototype, where it's just fun to run around and cause havoc in different parts of the city, and the progression comes from doing the different story quests that test your abilities, and from getting stronger and unlocking new ones. Sometimes the world alone can be enough for the game to stand out. On the surface level, Cyberpunk mechanically is similar to games that you have played before, and the quest system does borrow quite a bit from The Witcher 3. Now don't get me wrong, the combat system is a lot of fun and there's a lot of cool moments to achieve with a large amount of builds and playstyles that are possible, but the world itself is so mesmerizing. The atmosphere of Night City is so unique and vibrant that it makes itself stand out so much more from the other open world games.
Yes, I am very biased, how could you tell?
The characters, the gangs, and even the random NPCs are so vibrant, and the city has a visceral, violent feeling that's basically a character in itself. And that's why, despite the problems this game has, it still remains memorable to myself and so many others. Even in games I don't really like that much, I can still appreciate the level of detail and vibrancy that the world can give off. I don't even really like Elden Ring that much, but I can still appreciate the beauty of the lands between. The variety of the architecture, the Erd tree constantly in the backdrop, and the sky blooming with a beautiful color. And when you change locations, everything gets shifted around you, and it feels like you're in an entirely new world. All of this alone is enough to appreciate in a game, but it's important to couple that with something that makes it engaging. Because if your game is just an open world to attract the largest number of players possible, then people will tell. I've talked about it before, but the open world in Dragon Age Inquisition is tedious as hell. This is coming from a series of games that have never been open world, so it's noticeable and has a very awkward shift when playing. And it doesn't help that the mechanics of this game are not the most innovative thing in the world. This game's combat is more clunky than Skyrim, and the world is more shallower than a puddle in the Mojave Desert. And it doesn't help that the quests are just copy and paste fetch quests that barely change. The only real thing that keeps me going in this game is the story and the character interactions, which I admit are good, but this already exists in previous games without an open world. Going open world for the sake of it is such a dangerous thing to do because it can very easily get tiring and tedious for just having this massive map and doing the same shit over and over again. Ubisoft is infamous for this. They reached a peak with their 2 landmark titles, and after that, they refused to innovate further. So every game afterwards has been a copy and paste palette swap with the same mechanics and gameplay that earned them the reputation of being dull and boring, and selling the same product over and over again. There's a reason why Assassin's Creed is lumped with Call of Duty and FIFA for the most repetitive bullshit that keeps on releasing every year. And they try to trick people into thinking that they're different by putting a Mass Effect wheel in the newer titles. You're not tricking me, fuckers! I know my decisions don't fucking matter! And it's doubly frustrating when you notice that the mechanics of these games have barely evolved past the games that were made years ago. Far Cry is a series that has fallen so far from what it used to be, but it hurts even more because the games have potential to be great and do have good variety from game to game, but the mechanics don't. When you're unlocking the same gun variants, raiding outposts, and confronting another villain on the cover art, you're basically playing Far Cry 3 again. But there's also times where the uniqueness of the open world can work outside of its favor as well. FromSoft games are known for having convoluted quest lines with the NPCs that the player has to figure out through the clues of what the NPCs say, and going to different locations at the right times. And like I said before, for a Metroidvania style game, that works. Because these games, despite the difficulty ladder, it doesn't really take that long for them to be completed. But in a massive open world game where you are encouraged to explore, discover new locations, fight new enemies, and the single playthrough can net you around 100 hours, when the quests use the same method, and you don't even get a list to keep track of them, it gets a little annoying. And I know people are going to comment about how I'm a dumb zoomer who can't pay attention to what's being told to me, but I don't care. At least give me something to keep track of a quest in the game because I shouldn't have to do this myself, alright? And I guarantee you, the people that got the Ronnie ending on their first playthrough absolutely followed a guide. Because how else are you supposed to figure this shit out? And also, to all you Ronnie simps out there, really? The manipulative fucking puppet is the one you choose as your goddess? Yeah, fuck no. Nefeli is the true best girl of this game. She's the one that helps you fight Godric, and she looks good doing it. Shout out to Barbarian girls. Gotta be one of my favorite genders. But the main point I'm trying to make with this is that it's important to always make your game stand out. Having the same methods as other games can make it blend a little too much and it can lack originality. But if you go too far from the familiar mechanics, it can get frustrating and become too daunting for new players. Your game needs to bring something new to the table, whether it's through the world that it takes place in, the story being told, or the mechanics of the game itself. There are plenty of ways to make them stand out. And even if the game itself has familiar tropes that other open world games have, they can still just present them in a unique way to make traversal more engaging. Now, naturally, everyone's going to have their preference on what their preferred open world is. I enjoy driving cars around large cities. I enjoy using guns, both modern and advanced, and I enjoy more sci-fi oriented games. I also enjoy traveling a war-torn wasteland, witnessing the destruction of the world that has been in shambles for hundreds of years, fighting off mutated creatures and other wastelanders that do whatever they can do to survive. But I understand the appeal of fantasy games, traveling as a lone adventurer through a land with a goal of getting more powerful, whether it's through blades or sorcery. And to put yourself into an imaginative world with different whimsical races to slay dragons is a fun sensation that is enough to captivate anyone. We all have our preferences on what makes these games compelling, and each of them is capable of being compelling to someone. Now, with all that being said, it may sound like I dislike open world games, and with how a lot of modern games have been, I thought that was the case too. But I realized that it's not the trope itself that I have a problem with, but rather the oversaturation of it. RPGs don't need to be open world to give more variety with the choices and character builds. Shooters don't need to go open world to give freedom to the player, or whatever dumb excuse they give. Mass Effect Andromeda took a series that never fully dived into the open world trope and made it into a long fetch quest filled mess with nothing worlds that, while pretty to look at, don't even come close to the quality that can be found in the original trilogy. I have yet to play the Halo Infinite campaign because I have no interest in investing in an open world game that seems to only be service level, especially when games prior did not have open worlds and instead consisted of engaging levels that were fun to play multiple times. Devs need to realize that sometimes, less is more, and there's no need to always try to one-up each other or yourselves to make the biggest game imaginable. Bigger doesn't always mean better, and the bloat can kick in at any time. Even the good games tend to be too massive for their own good, extending too much to the point where they're just too intimidating and daunting. I have said before that not everything is for everyone, and they shouldn't be, but I do think that there is an importance to keep things reasonably achievable. It's why my favorite open world games are the smaller, more reserved ones, where the maps are more condensed but very focused.
Finally, I leave you with this. The next time you're playing an open world game, ask yourself these questions. Do I feel like I'm part of the world? Does the gameplay give a sense of immersion to the open world itself? Does this game benefit from having this big of a playground? Or does it just feel like I'm just ticking off boxes off a map? Because at the end of the day, a world should feel like a world, and not a shopping list. And that's all I got. Thank you guys for watching. Take care.